Well, good afternoon. My name is Dan Churchwell, and I'm the Associate Director of Programs here at the Acton Institute. And it's such a delight to introduce Dr. Jay Richards today for our Acton Lecture Series. I've known Jay for several years, and he's no stranger to the Acton Institute, working here for several years. He's gone on to do more and wonderful things at the Busch School of Business at the Catholic University of America. He is the executive editor of The Stream and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. And if you look inside your program, you can see he is published widely across multiple mediums, both online and in print. We've had the joy of having him on the podcast multiple times here at the Acton Institute. And he is also the executive producer of multiple documentaries. So, I mean, he's in TV, he's in radio, he's in online, and he's in print. And he is a very active voice in helping people think culturally, theologically, and philosophically about a multitude of issues. Today we have the pleasure of having him here to talk about his brand new book, The Human Advantage, which we have for sale in the back, in which he will be happy to sign a copy for you afterwards if you stick around. So without further ado, please welcome with me Dr. Jay Richards.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Well, it's great to be with you. And so the book is new enough that I haven't figured out how to really make a cogent case for my argument in 30 minutes, but I'm going to still try to do it because I'd like to spend maybe half of our time actually just having conversation about it. But some of you may have noticed that there has been a lot of hype lately about automation and robotics and digitization and artificial intelligence. And the question is what we should do with the hype. The claim is essentially whether it's a sort of dystopian or utopian take on this subject. It's something like this, that sometime in the next 5 to 30 years, something like half of all jobs are going to disappear. And it's not just that those jobs are going to disappear and then new, different jobs will reappear, but rather that this portends the end of work, for good or for ill. Some people say it's the end of work, it's going to be awful. The government needs to give everybody a basic income to prevent this, or at least to mitigate it, since nobody will have a job to do. And there's also the utopian side, which is that the robots are going to do all the work, and so we don't have to work and we can just play. Right? That's the basic framework of the argument, unfortunately, at the moment. But notice that both actually presuppose something. They both presuppose, just to kind of reduce the philosophical thread of my book to one proposition, they assume that humans and machines are the same kinds of things. They assume, as one robotics professor put it, that human beings are just machines made of meat. And so if we're just machines and we're the result of some blind impersonal process that gave rise to consciousness and action and intelligence, why on earth wouldn't we be able to actually design machines that can do these things better than we can, and so literally to replace us? But if you don't assume that, if for instance, you think there's really good philosophical arguments for the proposition that we're not machines, then all of a sudden the stakes change completely. And so this is both a debate about technology, about economics, about the sort of things that you would expect, but it is at bottom really a debate about the nature of the human person. It's essentially a metaphysical or a philosophical debate, but the philosophy is usually just under the surface. You don't actually see that. So the book is, in many ways, it's a critique of this idea, both on economic grounds, based on what we know about technology, but it's also a philosophical critique of this strident materialism that treats us as machines and so makes deductions based on that assumption. Well, a lot of people make this argument, but in the book, my sort of primary foil is a guy named Martin Ford, who wrote a book recently called The Rise of the Robots. And he take this as the representative sample, the representative argument that machines are going to take all the job. Here's what he says. He says, the shift now underway will ultimately challenge one of our most basic assumptions about technology. The machines are tools that increase the productivity of workers. Instead, machines themselves are turning into workers. So in other words, okay, yeah, different times in economic history, at different inflection points, say when we moved from an agrarian to an industrial economy, we developed technology, combines and tractors and plows and things like this, that made our labor more productive, but all it did is enhance our labor. It didn't literally replace us. The argument is that what we're doing now is we're building machines that will literally replace us. And this is quite a literal point. Now, anyone that knows economic history is going to suspect this is already a terrible argument because, in fact, any technology that you develop, if it enhances labor, it makes labor more productive, it's going to make some earlier way of doing something obsolete. So in a sense, and if everybody's assigned a job, it's going to make some job obsolete. So when you invent a shovel, it makes digging by hand obsolete. When you invent a tractor, it makes digging with shovels obsolete. But what's always happened is that even though some prognosticator might say, oh no, technology is going to destroy whole segments of society and the jobs will never be replaced, that never is what happens. What happens is that certain ways of doing things disappear because they're obsolete. They're the kind of less efficient ways of doing things. And then the cost usually for those goods and services, let's take something like food, goes down. And that creates entirely new markets that didn't exist before. So that now, right, less than 2% of the population now lives and works on farms compared to 95% of the population at the time of the American founding. But that process, though it was disruptive, didn't create 94% unemployment. There are 10 times more people in the country, and people generally have even a lot better jobs than were available in 1776. That's the kind of history and the economics of it. But the AI argument, the argument about automation and artificial intelligence is that, well, this time is totally different. This time, in fact, no, we're not just going to have our labor enhanced, we're going to actually be replaced, without remainder. So that's the argument. Well, so at the risk of spoiling all the fun, here's my conclusion. Don't buy it. There are deep flaws within this, and the flaws may not be obvious because it seems that so many of the officially smart people believe this. Nevertheless, it's not true. But before I say why I think that is, I do think that believers, and Christians in particular, people that believe in biblical revelation, should find this picture disturbing, this claim that people are going to be without work, whether you're reading the dystopians or the utopians. And the reason is because work itself is not the result of the fall. Toil and futility in our work is the result of the fall. But if you read the first chapter of Genesis, what happens? God creates man and woman in his image. And then he doesn't send them to a lounge, right? He doesn't send them to a spa, right? He blesses them and says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And then remember, God puts Adam in the garden to till and to keep it, to work the garden. That's part of what it means to be made in the image of God, is to work. Probably the most I think the most beautiful expression or articulation of this is found in Pope John Paul II's 1981 encyclical, Laborem Exercens. It's just packed with quotes it's about work. And so the encyclical is about that. But I just want to give you one line from this. He says, work is a good thing for man, a good thing for his humanity, because through work, man not only transforms nature, adapting it to his own needs, but he also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, becomes more a human being. So in other words, because we are created with natures to create and to work, and to create value, think of work as creating value, we actually become more of what we are. Of course, we start with a human nature. It's not like we start out reptiles, right, and then through our work become humans. We start out with a human nature, but it's not fully developed. We only fully develop what it means to be human through our work. So any prediction that says work is going to be obsolete is ultimately a dystopian vision, and I think one that's sort of flatly in contradiction with this idea that work is a good thing. And in fact, we know from health studies and happiness studies that many people find their happiness and fulfillment in life precisely through work. Most people, if they were just simply recreating all the time, would actually end up very depressed. And I think there's probably some of you in this room that would know that's certainly true. So that's sort of the backdrop. Now, I'm not saying, I don't want you to think I'm a sort of Pollyannish character here that says that there's nothing to worry about. There is something to worry about, and I would say it's the key thing we have to deal with. But it's not permanent technological unemployment. What is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's try that again. I can tell you what it says. Here it is. It's not the end of work, but it's the accelerating pace of change and disruption. So if you think about the disruption that happened in the shift from the agricultural economy from 1776, say, until 1980, that took place over a couple of hundred years, right? It was disruptive. My grandfather on my mother's side suffered from the disruption, but entire generations went by before this actually happened. Now, compare that to the fundamental technological transformations that have happened in most of our lifetimes. If you're older than 40, you have passed from the time, just with one technology. So think of the technology for transmitting music. As a very small child, I listened to my mom's LPs. In fact, I went to bed with the Sound of Music soundtrack as a little kid. I shouldn't admit that publicly, but that's how it started. My dad then invested heavily in something called 8-track tape technology, which was a flash in the pan. It was terrible, got displaced by cassettes. That got displaced by CDs, which is mostly where I spent my money in music. And then what were CDs displaced by? I checked the other day. I think it's been 9 years since I bought a CD. It's because iPhones were invented in 2007. And so what do we do now? Mostly, when we access music, we either stream or we download MP3 files, which are entirely digital goods. So we've moved from the world of molecules and atoms to the world of bits. That's one function has changed in 5 different ways just in our lifetime. That gives you a hint at the disruption that is coming. Any job and any particular function that can be automated, whether it's an intellectual job or a physical manual labor job or a factory job, will get automated. It just will. I think that if you want to prepare for the future, assume that if this thing can be reduced to a system of rules, whether it has to do with doing stuff with your body or with your mind, it's going to probably get automated, and that's going to create disruption. It doesn't follow, though, that everything that humans do of value gets replaced in this way. And so then that's the question. But to get this, you have to understand what the main features of the information economy are. And this is kind of the bulk of the first half of my book, is just explaining, okay, what makes the information economy unique? What makes it what it actually is? How is it different from earlier stages of economic development? And there are basically 5 features. One I've already told you about. It's highly disruptive because it happens very quickly. The growth in the information economy, it tends to be exponential rather than linear. I'll talk about these in a minute. I'm just giving you the outline. It's digital. Right? So think about that for a minute. We all use that word, but do we know what it means? It's hyper-connected. That needs no explanation. And it's ever more informational. If you get these 5 features of the information economy, I think you'll get the gist of it. Now, I already told you what disruption is, but let's treat that basically as the main cost of the economy, and then talk about these other things. Many of you have probably heard about Moore's Law. In fact, I've been talking about Moore's Law for years. It's a term named after an observation made by a guy named Gordon Moore in 1965 when he worked at Fairchild Semiconductor. He later went on to co-found the Intel Corporation. But he noticed that engineers were able to put twice the number of transistors on an integrated circuit about every 18 months from what they had been able to do before. So in other words, the number of transistors they could cram onto a little computer chip doubled about every 18 months. All right, now, so what that means, it's hard to get this intuitively, but in other words, they weren't just adding incrementally, right? 1, 2, 3. It was rather 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, up you go. Very quickly, those numbers, when you've got an exponential growth, get completely out of control. That's the idea of Moore's Law, and it was just applied to this one type of technology, the integrated circuit, the computer chip that we're still using. And at the time, he thought that probably will just happen maybe for the next 10 years. But another guy that I've written about and talked about for a long time, named Ray Kurzweil, wondered if maybe this growth, this exponential growth, what he called the law of accelerating returns, might actually exist in other places. And so he's written a couple of very large books in which he sees it everywhere. He sees exponential growth everywhere. And so I don't go anywhere near as far as he does on this. But one really important observation he made is that he said, okay, you know what? The technology we used at the end of the 20th century, the computer chip, is only one of 5 ways we did computing, even in the 20th century. And so what happens if we were to sort of calculate the amount of computing power you could get for $1,000 at any particular point in time in the 20th century? And then you graph that, what would it look like? And here's what he discovered. It's Moore's Law It's exponential growth all the way back. So 5 different types of technology, from a kind of electromechanical to a relay system to a vacuum tube system around World War II, to transistors, and finally to integrated circuits. So in other words, why does this matter? This means that this trend of exponential growth transcends the physical media. So it's not something that's based in, say, the physics of crystalline silicon. It's some kind of weird trend it represents something else, right? It's not the physics of computation. It's something about the information technology, and we find different ways to do it. So if this continues, we don't know for sure, but if this trend continues, this means at some point we'll reach the end of the physical value of computer chips and we'll switch to a different form of computation. But if you get this kind of exponential trend for a long period of time, really crazy things start happening. Now, this happens all around us, but let me give you just one intuitive example that Kurzweil pointed out in 2013 in the Wall Street Journal. He said, a kid in Africa with a smartphone is walking around with $1 trillion of computation circa 1970. In 1961, it would have taken $8.3 trillion to buy the same computing power you get for 8 cents in 2013. Okay, so there's nothing like this that happens in most of the economy. There's not exponential growth in our efficiency increases in the use of energy, right? The Moore's law doesn't apply to hydrocarbons. It doesn't apply to real estate or anything like this, or to buildings. But in the information-dense parts of the economy, it happens in spades. And I'm just giving you one example. In fact, Moore's law is put to shame in other areas. So store width, for instance, the amount of data that you can store either on a hard drive or on a cloud, it's vastly outstripping Moore's law in terms of exponential growth. So this is happening across hundreds of different technologies simultaneously. So that's exponential growth. What's digitization? It's a kind of a complicated subject, but the simplest way to put it is to say that digitization is the shift from the world of atoms and molecules, I mentioned a minute ago, to the world of bits, to the world of information. Now, information is always involved. When the first guy in a cave, clicked 2 flint rocks together to start a controlled fire, that was an informational act. He's doing something for a purpose, and he's constraining possibility. But now, we actually can sort of see this happening, in which things move from matter, the realm of matter, to the realm of information. What does that mean? Well, it means that goods and services that are digital have these 2 completely different properties, fundamentally different properties than normal physical goods. As economists would say, this is only 2 of 3 economic terms I'll use, I promise, is that they are non-rival, the goods are non-rival, and they have virtually 0 marginal cost. Now, what does that mean? Think about the Encyclopedia Britannica. Imagine that you want to buy, for some reason, you want to buy the entire set of the Encyclopedia Britannica, maybe as a signal of your intelligence, right, or your wealth or something, and you want to have it on yourself. Now, that set of the Encyclopedia Britannica is a rival good. That just means that if I have it, you can't have it. If it's in my bookshelf, right at the same time, it can't be at home in your bookshelf, right? It can only be one place at one time. So it's a rival good. It also doesn't have 0 marginal cost. Now, even if the Encyclopedia Britannica company, let's say they printed 100,000 sets of this in China or someplace where they can get sort of cheap printing, right? They can bring the unit cost down. Nevertheless, every additional copy or every set that they make, it's going to take up space. It has to be transported. It uses paper and glue and cardboard and ink and all that stuff. That's never going to be free. Right? They can try to reduce costs, but it's always going to cost something. It's going to take up natural resources and time and things like that. Now, compare that to an Encyclopedia Britannica subscription, in which you simply buy a subscription for $69 online. When you get a subscription, did one leave a warehouse? Was there a sort of store of subscriptions to Encyclopedia Britannica and one was depleted? No. You haven't reduced the stock of those at all. If you download a song on iTunes for $1.29, you haven't caused one to disappear from the store so that somebody else isn't going to get it, like an old CD. Right? That's not how it works. That's the significance, because if you think about economics as at least partly about how we allocate resources in a context of scarcity, now we're dealing with these weird goods and services that are strangely abundant. And notice also, so it's non-rival, right? They don't compete with each other. And it's also basically zero marginal cost. To actually calculate the cost, once all the infrastructure is in place, the actual cost to the Apple Corporation of you downloading that MP3 file is pretty darn close to zero. So zero marginal cost effectively and non-rival goods. That's digitization. That has huge implications, and as more of the economy is able to move, more of goods are able to move it from atoms to bits, we should expect to see more like this. And this is why actually the study of information economics is very interesting, because it requires new tools and ideas. The fourth is that it's hyper-connected. Now you all know exactly what this means, because if you have children, you deal with it constantly because your kids, without your permission, end up using Snapchat even before you figure out what the heck it is, and they're doing stuff. Anyone that has a smartphone, right, is directly connected, usually both by cellular network and also to the internet and to your apps. You can monitor your health and how many steps you're taking and where your children are at any particular time. I don't do that. I'm just saying you can do this in principle, right? That's hyperconnectivity. There's a book a couple of years ago called The Inevitable by a guy named Kevin Kelly, who's an editor at Wired Magazine. And he said, 1,000 years from now, if we're still here, people will look back on this time in which we live now as a precious and amazing time. Because it was at this moment that human beings first connected themselves entirely across the planet to one thing. That's already happened. A majority of the population already is in principle connected to each other at roughly the speed of light. And it's only going to get faster, and it's going to get more detailed, because there's something called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law is like Moore's law applied to networks. It basically says that the value of a network increases exponentially as the number of users gets on the network. So it's often been said that the guy that sold the first telephone was the most amazing salesman in the world. All right, well, think about it. Why? Because if telephone's useless if none other exist in the universe. It's only valuable if somebody else has a telephone, you're connected to them, and you want to talk to them, right? Then it's valuable, but there's only one interaction that's possible, or maybe two, right, if you think about each relationship, just these two people. Add a third person, and now you increase the number of possible interactions. You add 4 and you add 5. The value of this goes up exponentially. And so you end up with these weird things called network effects and winner-take-all scenarios, where once networks get to a certain size, everybody wants to be a part of that network. So if you think about Waze or a traffic app, they only get good when there are enough people using the app to bring data and information into the network. And then once they get big and the information gets good, more people want to be on that network. And so this is why there are not 9 equally good and popular networks, say, on iTunes. You don't want to be the 9th best traffic app on iTunes. You want to be the first or the second, right? That's hyperconnectivity. And then finally, and probably most abstractly, is that the economy is becoming ever more informational. Now, I could drone on about this point for 20 minutes easily, and it actually deserves that. But the key question is really, what exactly is information? If you've read Claude Shannon, he's the sort of founder of information theory. He was the guy working in Bell Labs in the 1950s who first thought about, okay, how can you measure the amount of information in a message that's going across a channel? Is there a way to actually measure it? And then if we could measure it, would there be a way to compress it so that it could be transmitted more efficiently? And it was Shannon that came up with this idea of the bit, of measuring this ephemeral thing, information, in a particular unit. See, that's amazing. Think about it. Information doesn't have weight. It doesn't have volume. It doesn't have color. And yet Shannon found a way to measure it. Now, what is a bit? A bit is essentially a collapse of possibilities. Shannon called it, it's a surprise. So if I have a coin and I decide, okay, let's flip the coin here, and it's a regular quarter, so it's got heads and tails. I flip it, and it comes down tails. That's one bit of information. Before, it was just this possibility of two things. The one actuality is one bit. And so if I flip the coin 10 times and wrote down the heads, heads, tails, 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 I did this, by the way, for the book, and I got 7 heads in a row. This only happens when you actually, if you guessed it, you'd even it out, right? But now you can actually measure the amount of information in that string of heads and tails. But this is also the problem with Shannon's definition of information, because the string of heads and tails is random gibberish. Right? It's not information as we actually understand it. And so I'll show you how weird this is. So imagine you take a sentence from Shakespeare. Methinks it's like a weasel. Now you can measure the amount of information in that as well. Right? You can actually figure out what are the chances of the 26 letters and the spaces, and you can come up with an information measure in Shannon's terms. But now let's say you just scramble the letters, so it's just gibberish, same letters in a different order. They would still have the same amount of information in Shannon's sense, even though now it's obviously completely uninformative. So this tells you that when we're talking about information just in a computer context, we're not capturing what information actually is in its richest and most fundamental sense. Now, the reason this is important, I hope you'll see in just a minute, is that this is the reason, this is the key reason that information technology is never going to literally replace us. So what is information? Let me simplify it. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Victoria in British Columbia. If you go there in the summer when it's very nice. You can take a ferry from Port Townsend, I think, or Bellingham or Seattle into the inner harbor of Victoria in British Columbia. And it's so placid that they put their Parliament building right by the water. That's ocean. And yet we've got to go, that's like the Capitol building 100 feet from the Atlantic or something like that, right? And the amazing thing about this harbor, though, is you go in and there's an outer harbor where it gets nice and peaceful, and then a tiny little inner harbor where you completely forget this vast ocean that's behind you. Now, if you do it during the daytime rather than at night, you will notice something, especially in the summer, on the side of the hill. If you look very carefully. If you look very carefully, you see the green grass that's just in front of the Parliament building there. You can just barely see it. You probably can't make it out. Anybody see what that says? Can you see it yet? It's actually at a 45-degree angle to the line of sight. So it's Welcome to Victoria. That's right, it's right there. Now, when you saw it, right, and you started looking at it, when you detected information, which is what you did, you immediately recognized that's information. What were you doing intellectually? What was happening there? What is the thing? What caused you not to say, well, I mean, any way that seeds fall on the ground is going to be highly improbable, right? I mean, you could just scatter them out. It's highly improbable. So maybe geese flying south, Canadian geese, they fly. They maybe eat seeds from begonias, and they just dropped them there, and it landed on the way south. Now, is that logically possible? I suppose, but that's not the explanation. You know something's happening. So what do you know, and how do you know it? What are you knowing? Well, you're using your background information, your background knowledge of where you are, right? You're in this place called Victoria, your knowledge of the English language and syntax and grammar and spelling. And then that causes you to see not just an improbable thing, not just an improbable sequence of shapes, but a sequence of shapes that conforms to an independently given, meaningful pattern. Information, in the most fundamental sense, is about meaning. Now, why does that matter? It matters because what is meaning exactly? Well, meaning is in part, at least when you're dealing with communication, it's the recognition that one agent has of the activity of another intelligent agent, right? And so you're looking through, in this case, you're looking through the physical medium of the flowers arranged to the meaning of its author. That's what information and information recognition is. Now, where does that come from? Where does that kind of information come from? Information theorist Henry Klausler said we habitually associate the creation of new information with the activity of an intelligent agent. Another theorist says information is not matter or energy. It's some fundamentally new thing. Any materialism that will survive to the present age must account for that. This is why machines cannot ever replace us. Insofar as economics and economic development and the creation of value is about the creation of new forms of information, either actual text, right, or software, or three-dimensional structures. The faces on Mount Rushmore, those are informational in a way that the pile of rocks at the bottom is not. Right, so this is why we have hope that we're not ever going to get replaced by the robots. Nevertheless, you do need to do something to prepare for it. And I spend a lot of time on this, but we're almost out of time. So let me tell you, this is the gist of how not to be replaced by robots. You want to focus on your comparative advantage over machines. So what does it mean to be a person rather than a machine? It means at least this, that you are an intelligent agent with consciousness, subjective first-person experience, and the ability to act and to choose from alternatives for a purpose, right? For a purpose. So you do things intentional at least part of the time, right? So you have freedom, you have a capacity to actually make things happen and make one thing happen rather than another thing happen for a reason. Machines don't do that. Machines can represent, and they can sift, and they can transmit, and they can store information that has been created to do amazing things, but they don't create new meaning in the same way. And the good news here is that this is something that human beings, because of our nature, because of what John Paul said, can do in abundance. We can, through our work and through our action, actually make ourselves more than we were before. That's what virtues are. Right? A virtue is essentially you acting in a particular way for a purpose, a good thing that you do, and you do it enough that it becomes a habit. And then if you keep at that habit, it eventually works its way back into your being so that through your will and action, you become more than you were before. You develop a virtue. So for anyone that's thinking, okay, well, oh good, now that we've got information technology, I can be anti-human and misanthropic, and that's okay because I'll get a computer engineering degree and I'll be fine. In fact, that's not really true. Maybe a few people can do well that way, but the reality is that there's still basic virtues you need. You still are going to need to be punctual. You're going to need to be nice to people, right? You're going to need to maybe not commit felonies on the job, things like that, right? But there are these key virtues that you actually need that, my argument would be that these are the virtues you want to develop if you want to maximize your potential for success and flourishing in the information economy. And there's 5 virtues, each of which corresponds to one of those features of the information economy. The first is courage. Courage is just the virtue of being willing to act in the context of failure. This is really important in a highly disruptive age because what that means is you might be in college thinking you're studying something that's useful, and then you start a job and realize actually this whole thing has become obsolete, right? And you might try a couple of things and fail. And so you need to know that because you don't know the future and you know that things are going to change. And so rather than, maybe earlier generations could have courage forced upon them, like the Irish who immigrated to the United States, they had virtually no alternatives, so courage is forced upon them. We now need, teenagers in the United States are not going to starve to death. They might live in their parents' basement for longer than they should, right? But they don't have that kind of necessity pressing upon them, which means that we have to cultivate courage as an actual virtue. Nevertheless, you might read sort of business books and business papers that talk about failure as the path to success. That's not quite right. It's actually possible to just keep failing and never succeed. That's a bad plan for success, obviously, right? Well, now, the reason you need to accept failure is that you can't necessarily choose where you want to go on the very first shot. And so you need to couple courage with a second virtue, and this is a virtue that's very important in a time of exponential growth and change, anti-fragility. Language is from a guy named Nicholas Nassim Taleb who wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. And anti-fragility describes the virtue of a system or a person or a thing that improves when it's perturbed. So unlike a fragile thing, which just breaks easily if somebody sings loudly or you just put it in the wrong place in the dishwasher, for instance, and it breaks into a million pieces, that's fragile. Or robust and hard, like a rebar or titanium. It's a third type of thing that actually gets better as a result of stress. Biological systems are like this. If you lift weights like this guy and you do it properly, you're actually tearing your muscle fibers and creating an inflammatory response. But your body doesn't just, well, that's injured now, let's take it out of commission. No, it actually rebuilds the muscle stronger and a little larger than it was before. That's anti-fragility. So what does that have to do with a virtue? Well, anti-fragility is the ability not only to have courage and be willing to act in the context of failure and to fail, but to improve whether you succeed or fail. So either you succeed or you fail and you learn a lesson that you then calculate into everything else you do in the future. It's a really funny and insightful book by Scott Adams, the Dilbert guy, Dilbert cartoon guy called How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. And the book is really about all the really kind of dumb ideas he's had and ways he's wasted his money and lost his fortune a couple of times. But he managed to learn something that he added and sort of stacked in his pools of experience and experience so that he eventually succeeded. And he succeeded in a way he could not have succeeded if he had not done all those things, if he had gone directly there. Altruism was always important for entrepreneurs. Altruism in this sense, I don't mean just the altruism of Mother Teresa, of the self-sacrificial altruism, but simply acting for the benefit of the other. So this barista here, right, he may not know these women. Nevertheless, to be successful, to be good at his job, he has to be able to anticipate what they want and to provide it for them and to do it in a friendly way. That's altruism, right? And this is never more important than it is now, because now, before there were very limited things that most of us could do. I mean, think of the average farmer 200 years ago, had no plan B. The truth of the matter is now, if you're halfway educated and have minimal virtue, there are hundreds of things you could do, including goods and services you could produce. You might be a physical trainer at the local Planet Fitness, or you might make workout videos in your garage and just upload them to YouTube and actually make money that way, right? You might be a master carpenter, or you might sell handmade goods on Etsy and sell it to a worldwide market through this global marketplace. That's why altruism is so important, because there are many things you could do, but the things that you want to do if you're going to succeed, at least economically, is to provide things that people want and will freely buy. Collaboration, the fourth virtue, that's obvious. Collaboration is it's a form of humility in which you're willing to learn from others and to work with others in purposes that you could not achieve alone. The kind of person that thinks they're always the smartest person in the room is not a good collaborator. You know, there's a tech CEO who famously said, "I constantly remind myself that most of the smartest people in the world do not work for me. They work for someone else." That's a kind of a moment of humility. If you're a good collaborator, you learn to work well with lots of different people. And this is never more important than in a hyper-connected age. One of the things I do is I run an online news and commentary site called The Stream, stream.org if you're wondering. But The Stream, I work in my sweats most of the time, standing at my kitchen island, right? About six of the Stream staff are in Texas. The rest of the staff are all around the country in different time zones. And yet we can all see who's on and interact with each other because of this amazing networked technology and because of this platform that we're working on together. There's types of collaboration that are now possible at a global level, simultaneous global collaborations that were never before possible. And so collaboration is a key virtue. And then the final one is what I call creative freedom. Not just creativity and not just freedom. If you ask teenagers what freedom is, I've tested this hundreds of times, they will say freedom is getting to do what you want to do. Now that is a type of freedom. If you can choose vanilla or strawberry ice cream, nobody makes you pick one or the other. You're free in that sense. But it's actually a very narrow kind of freedom. So think about this little girl here, right, whose parents buy her a piano and say, you're free to play the piano. And so presumably that means she can go and sit down anytime she wants and she can sort of punch on the little keys, right? Is she free to play Rachmaninoff? Is she free to play that really hard movement in Moonlight Sonata that nobody plays because it's so hard? No, of course not. How would she be free to do that? She would only be free to do that if she constrained the possibilities in herself, and with all the things she could do, she decides to sit on that bench day after day and practice and do scales and go over and over and over hard sequences of songs. And then maybe after about 10 years, she will reach a stage in which she can not only play Rachmaninoff and be free to play Rachmaninoff, but free to create music that she could not create before. That's creative freedom. And notice that here, in this case, if you thought freedom is just this kind of unlimited possibility, to reach the higher level of creative freedom, you actually constrain the possibilities in yourself for a particular goal of creating some kind of value. In other words, these are informational and purpose-driven acts. And if you do that, this is in some ways, this is the virtue that culminates. It's the sort of culmination of all the other virtues. To be able to do this, you need self-discipline, you need the willingness to fail, you need to be able to learn from failure, all those things. You need to be able to learn how to play in a way that people would want to listen to, right? And this is, as it turns out, the source of information. Valuable information comes from our creative freedom. And so I really think the lesson of technology is not, yes, there are of course perils and promises. There always are. But what's happened in the literature and in much of our culture is that we make these amazing technologies and then we use it and we say, gosh, these things are amazing, and we use it to demote ourselves. So we attribute knowledge and intelligence and grandeur to the machines, but not to ourselves. In fact, what we should do is say, look, we're the ones that make these things. We're not just Homo sapiens, we're not just the wise man, we're Homo faber. We're man, the maker of machines. However amazing intelligent machines ever get, they will always be downstream from the creative freedom of actual human persons. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richards. So we'll have some time for some questions now. If you could please just wait until we can get the microphone to you in order to ask your question. That way we capture your question and for the recording. So who would like to go first?
I've watched all of this, and the thing that I'm trying to figure out is how do you motivate people to get away from yesterday, I'm in the dermatology office waiting my turn. 5 people come in and sit across from me. Every single one of them are on the phones. How do you get the creative, your virtues, how do you get people the incentive to do this? What creates that as opposed to sitting around waiting for somebody else to do that?
Yeah, that's nothing new. I mean, people have always, because of the fall, right, we will do kind of useless things or maybe even destructive things. Now, when I've been in Dulles Airport and looked around and seen everyone on their phones, and the reason I noticed is because I looked up from my phone. So it may be that they're being productive. I'm like approving articles and writing emails, right? I'm not playing games. But you're right. I mean, we need to be reflective of this. But the question is then, how do we get people to develop these virtues? Because it's the narrow way. There's no easy answer, and it's not any different than it ever was, is that we need virtue-forming institutions. What are the most important virtue-forming institutions? Family, church, neighborhood, culture. This is, I think, this is our key challenge, is that we're at a moment of unprecedented exponential growth and disruption and change at the very time that the institutions' virtue formation are under attack. So at the very moment when you need healthy, virtuous churches and intact families, these institutions are being attacked from within and from without. That's our key challenge. But people don't develop virtue on their own. No one gives birth to themselves. You're ideally born into families and you learn most of the stuff that you need from your families and your churches and your neighborhoods. So that it's basically the same traditional answer as it always has been. It's not going to be a technological solution. It's an institutional virtue-forming solution.
Jay, could you explain again how the barista was altruistic?
Yes, absolutely. So altruism, I know you won't know what I'm talking about, everybody, as you see his picture, so I'll pull it up. And so altruism is from the Latin word alter. Alter means acting for the benefit of the other. Now, we often use it to refer just to self-sacrifice. In fact, this is what Ayn Rand did. If you read Ayn Rand, she said capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They're philosophical opposites. What's she saying? She defined altruism as self-sacrifice. So acting for the benefit of the other at your own expense in some way that cost you. That is a virtue. She hated it, but that's also a virtue. That's what Christ did for us. That's what a soldier does when he throws himself on a grenade. That's a type of altruism, right? But that's a species of altruism. And altruism is a genus which is acting for the benefit of the other. And so a successful entrepreneur in a market economy, the famous line about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker in Adam Smith, his point wasn't that the butcher ought to be greedy, right? His point about self-interest is that, yeah, he can actually he can care about paying for his daughter's braces, but to succeed, what's he going to have to do? He's going to have to anticipate what his customers would want and need and then provide that. So it's an orientation of action and a sort of altruistic act that's beneficial, and it's also beneficial in this case to him. So what I'm saying is that the creation of value economically can happen in different ways. It can happen in self-sacrificial ways. It can also happen in mutually beneficial ways. And in fact, usually it's both things. Because of course, if you act self-sacrificially, that's also beneficial to you spiritually. And so I think sometimes what we want to do is we want to segregate these things too far. But that's basically the idea. And my argument is that altruism is especially important now because there are 1,000 things that you could do with information technology and networking technology. Only a few of them will actually provide something that people want. And so I spoke to a high school graduating class last spring, and one of my arguments in the book is that you shouldn't follow your passion. You should find out what people want, what you might be good at, try to do that, and then the passion will follow and inspire you because you're actually creating value. It's the only time we tell 18-year-olds, well, just do whatever you feel. That's the worst advice. Your passions change daily, right? So this is, the idea is that you want to sort of channel and focus on of the many things you could do, fritter away your time on Snapchat, right, or Candy Crush or whatever, or worse, into activities that have some promise of benefiting others and serving the needs of others. That's the idea.
Jay, there's a question about if robots will take your jobs. Might not be the right question. Is it will robots are taking your tasks?
Yes.
And there's a distinction between jobs and tasks. Can you
Yeah,
kind of speak to that a
absolutely.
little bit?
I mean, in both of these things, so a task is just a way of accomplishing something, right? And usually a task, you have lots of tasks as a job, and we use the word job to refer to kind of a bundle of related tasks that serve some kind of function, usually in the context of a company or something like that, right? So that's a discrete job. But of course, there's not perfect overlap. But, it's not like jobs and particular job descriptions are sort of written in the Platonic heaven. We do things in lots of different ways. And so some particular task or way of accomplishing a task could change. It doesn't follow that the task or the function disappears, right? It just may be that, just pick almost anything that you can think of, is that very often what happens is that you don't actually directly get replaced. In fact, most of the time what happens is that particular jobs get enhanced, so fewer people need to do that job, right, than needed to do it before. But the fallacy is, it's based in this something called the lump of labor fallacy, in which you assume there's this fixed amount of stuff that needs to be done. Again, it's just fixed. It's in the Platonic heaven. And if a machine does it, then that depletes the store of work to be done. But that's not how it is, because the work to be done has to do with the creation of value. And so it may be that 10 years from now, virtually all agricultural goods can be produced in hydroponic farms, inside, in warehouses, tended by autonomous drones that can repair themselves. Right? So in principle, no humans are actually involved in the production of food. Assume that, right? Let's say it's 20 years away. Does it follow no humans are going to be doing agriculture? No, not at all. What's actually happening right now? I can tell you that you can buy Boston Bibb lettuce made hydroponically at Costco, because I buy it, in Washington, D.C., or you can, on Saturdays, go to one of the many local farmers markets and buy produce and meat from local farmers who make organic, sort of pampered pork, grass-fed beef, and things like that. We end up changing the kinds of things that we want. And so what I actually anticipate happening is that we will continue to commodify and automate many things, goods, right? But what will happen is what I'm calling the bespoke labor economy will grow up in its place, because people, for whatever reason, still prefer this kind of human interaction. So what that means is that if you thought high technology meant only people that had technical degrees in computer engineering would have jobs, in fact, a lot of those jobs are going to get replaced by algorithms. What's not going to get replaced are the highly personal jobs. You might have a machine that can diagnose that you have cancer. I assure you no one is going to want a machine to tell him or her that he has cancer. Right? And so that doesn't mean all doctors disappear. It means the skills that you need to be a doctor will be prized differently than they were in the past. No questions for Stark? Okay.
I was fascinated by the shift in looking at non-rival goods. Are there certain industries or places where you see that happening because it does fundamentally change the market economy so much.
It does. And so, I mean, any of the goods that you can think of course, software by itself is the prime example of this, so software, but it's really information is the prime example of this. Thomas Jefferson, believe it or not, pointed this out. He said, if I give you an idea, I don't lose the idea, I just multiply it. Right? Henry James talked about the law of accelerating returns where you could do this. And so in many ways, basically what we're dealing with is things that are informational. Right? So once I give you an idea, or this is why we have patent protections and things like that, because somebody could figure it out, right? And then their intellectual property disappears. And so you license it. You're basically licensing an idea. And so anything that it can be converted to a more or less purely informational form is going to have this property of being a non-rival good and having effectively, approaching zero marginal cost. And so you just run through any of the kind of goods and services that can be done online, for instance, that you imagine needed to have a physical place, are going to be susceptible to these things. And at the moment, I mean, there are a lot of things, honestly, that I think 30 years ago we would never have imagined, or 40 years ago, that this thing, well, like an Encyclopedia Britannica, right? The idea that that's text, right? That's all this complicated information. And in fact, the subscription's way better than the text because it's constantly updated and it's interconnected and you've got video and things like that. And so I think at the moment, I would not be willing to say, okay, these things can be digitized and these things cannot. I mean, we're still flesh and blood. We're not angels, right? And just minds floating somewhere on the internet. We have bodies that need food and take up space. And so the world of atoms will always matter, of course. We're this unique hybrid of the material and the spiritual, right? But there will be many things, and the longer you think about it, the more you realize actually there's a lot of stuff. Like this, all the functions that are on your smartphone. I saw a recent estimate that it would have cost about $800,000 just a decade or so ago to do all the things that are now available on your smartphone. Yeah, and the apps are, I mean, the phone costs money, right? And the subscription, the apps cost almost nothing. So in many ways, the sky's the limit. We're not going to digitize food, though, right? There's sort of obvious points. So not going to digitize real estate. Now, if you listen to Ray Kurzweil, we will. He thinks we're going to upload ourselves around 2043, and we won't need to take up space, or not much space anyway. So we have time for more? Not sure what time it is. So we still have a couple of minutes.
Thank you. You were mentioning about we make things valuable. When everybody starts using it, right? Like you mentioned, example the invention of the telephone was really good and it was valuable because there were more people using it, right? So when we put that into context, like humans versus robots, how can we promote the fact that human jobs or human tasks are better in between robots, if we want human work to be more valuable? Yeah, well, and it's in many ways, I think there are things that robots actually, I should say, that machines do better. There are many. I mean, this is why we make them, right? Tractors do a better job. Now they still have to be driven, but they do a much better job than a person, or even probably 10 people. So the whole reason we make technology is because we want to sort of offload some particular task. And so I don't think there's anything fundamentally different with this kind of technology. It's more or less the same thing that's happening. At the same time, if economic growth and economic activity is about the creation of new value, about the creation of new meaningful information, humans are the only ones that do that. Machines, that's at least my argument, is that machines do not and will not ever actually do that. And so this is a risky prediction. Machines are not going to become conscious agents and start creating things in the way that we do. That's just sort of forever off the table for really basic metaphysical reasons. I give arguments for this in the book, and they don't presuppose theology. They're just sort of straight kind of public natural reason arguments for why we are not a machine. I mean, in many ways, that's the sort of argument, is that machines will not replace us because we are not machines. And we do things that are not just different from machines, that are fundamentally important, and that are at the center of economic activity and value creation. That's a sort of irony. You hear the word information economy, and you picture Skynet. You picture those scary robots, right, from Terminator. And this is what our imagination has been fueled by
science fiction. And so we sort of fear that. But in fact, I think that there's nothing like that is actually either taking place or going to take place. What we do is we import weird kind of metaphysical assumptions into our technology because of what we've seen. But there's no reason to think that a computer, when it gets fast enough and strong enough, is going to become a conscious agent or a mind than to think that a tractor, if you make it big and strong enough, will become an ox. They're just different things. They don't do that. If you talk to David Ferrucci, who was the head of the team that developed IBM's Watson. Watson was the computer that beat the 2 reigning champions in Jeopardy in 2011. And people sort of freaked out about that. And I wrote a piece called "I, for One, Welcome Our New Robot Overlords" after it was over, because it was all this panic. And you talk to David Ferrucci, he's like, oh, this is ridiculous. We know what's happening. We gave it a bunch of data and databases, and we created these statistical algorithms. And based on questions, it sort of runs the algorithm and says, okay, this is the most likely answer. But there's no there there. There's no agent acting. Any more than say in Google. If you want to know what the best AI is right now, it's Google search. We're all dealing with it every day. No one, I suppose, is really tempted to think, oh, there's a lady back there giving me these answers, right? You know that's not how it works. That would not be economical, obviously. There's too many searches. What's happening is that Google, it's not just a machine sitting somewhere. It is a bunch of server farms, very sophisticated software and algorithms, right? And then a network that's connected at its ends to billions of free agents, conscious agents, who do searches, we do queries, and then we pick answers. And then when we do that, we teach the Google algorithm, oh, this is a thing you need to correlate. And so what the Google AI is that it's this networked system of servers and networking technology and telephony and human beings inputting constantly. It's not like we're going to be able to just sort of forget that. And so the temptation might be, if you don't know what's actually happening, to think this seems kind of scary. And it'll get scarier. The Siri will eventually get kind of good, and sound like an actual person. But don't think that that means because it seems like a person that it actually is, or that it's likely to somehow become that. This is just, we need to tame. Look, I'm a sci-fi fan as much as anybody on the planet. I would never want to watch a robot movie where the robot didn't become conscious. That would be, okay, so think of a 2-hour and 15-minute movie about the ship's computer on Star Trek, right? That's never going to be a movie because it's deadly boring. And so it's always about the exploration of what it means to be human and can our machines become conscious. That's just a perennial literary theme. Don't think that that is grounded in anything like metaphysical reality. It's a fantasy. And whatever our worries are about digitization and artificial intelligence and robotics, that's not one of the things that we need to worry about. Thank you very much.